Within weeks of returning home from the Antipodes, the Wales family was off again to conquer Canada, this time using the royal yacht Britannia as a base. The Lady D mania was every bit as alarming as it had been in Australia and New Zealand. While Charles looked ever more dispensable by her side, and collected tributes on her behalf from disappointed fans, she took the country by storm. Her outfits were more dazzling, she attended more ceremonies, concerts and parades, planted more trees, held more hands and won more hearts. What people seemed to go crazy about, in Canada as much as everywhere else she went, was that she seemed so approachable. No one would have dreamed of lunging forward to touch, far less kiss, the Queen or even Princess Anne. But Diana looked sweetly vulnerable and waif-like, and her friendly style struck a chord with the crowds. She did common-sense things, like squatting on her heels to talk to children or to people in wheelchairs so as to be at their level, and if someone dropped something in front of her, she would bend down to retrieve it for them. She had youth, beauty, glamour and a lightness of touch, which had never been seen in the royal family before. It was a winning combination that was rapidly turning her into a superstar that no one in the royal household had any idea how to handle. Diana was becoming intoxicated by the adulation. Wherever she went, she was the center of attention, and she could see that with no more than a coquettish tilt of the head or a teasing laugh, men, and women too, fell like ninepins in her thrall. The adoration of strangers in some curious way made up for the vacuum she felt in real life and in her marriage. Away from the cameras and the cheering, she struggled with feelings of emptiness and depression, and her moods continued to swing violently. Having tried everything in his power to help, Charles had run out of ideas and of sympathy. As he felt the chill of being outside the spotlight, the old feelings of insecurity and inadequacy that had haunted his youth came back with a vengeance. He didn't understand what went on inside her head, or what he had done to incite such vitriol. The more he retreated into himself, the more she raged against his absences and lack of concern, and the more she convinced herself that his friends were conspiring behind her back. Her suspicions were completely unfounded, and Charles had spoken to no one about their difficulties, but her obsession ate away at her and corroded what little was left of their relationship. He became uncharacteristically moody and prone to violent outbursts of temper that he unleashed on his most loyal and trusted staff. People like Michael Colborne, who had been with him in the Navy and who had tried so hard to help Diana, were being lambasted for spending too much time with her. Gone was the man Colborne had known in his bachelor years, a man thirsty for life, who was ready to have a go at anything and everything, who worked hard and drove himself hard, but who was fun to be with. The joy seemed to have gone out of his life, and the serious side to his nature, which had always been there, appeared to have taken over. Early the next year Diana became pregnant again, as if by a miracle, she would later say, and on the 15th of September Prince Harry was born. Charles was again with her throughout, and the next morning brought William to see his new brother. Diana would later say that for 6 weeks before his birth she and the prince were closer than they had ever been, or ever would be. Then suddenly as Harry was born it just went bang, our marriage, the whole thing went down the drain. She claimed it was because Charles was disappointed the baby was another boy, and a redhead. Something inside me closed off. Those around them at the time say that if Charles was disappointed he showed not the slightest trace of it. He appeared to be thrilled to have another son, saying, "We almost have a full polo team," and was again overwhelmed by the miracle of childbirth. But there was going to be no miracle cure for the marriage. Diana was spared the chronic postnatal depression she had suffered after William's birth, but the bulimia was bad, as were her mood swings, and her demands were increasingly unrealistic. She insisted that Charles spend more time with the children and sent a note to Edward Eton, their private secretary, saying that in future her husband would not be available for meetings in the early mornings or evenings because he would be upstairs in the nursery with William. Eton, a bachelor with no children, and a courtier of the old school, was dumbfounded. Mornings and evenings were the two moments in their normally hectic day when they had time to go through vital briefings. As his relationship with Diana deteriorated, the prince became temperamental and depressed and hugely demanding of everyone around him. He cut back on his engagements and spent many a contemplative hour digging the garden at Highgrove or riding hard, pushing himself physically to the limits. And having cut his closest and oldest friends out of his life, he became isolated in his misery. The press was quick to notice that he was slowing down. They had calculated that in the same 3-month period, Prince Charles had carried out 15 engagements while Princess Anne had done 56, Prince Philip 45 and the Queen 28. Meanwhile he seemed to have plenty of time for polo. They were calling him work-shy and lazy. His father told him to pull his socks up. Prince Philip had no time for the soul-searching his son seemed engaged in and less time for men minding the babies. Charles, who had been plagued ever since he came out of the Navy by the feeling that he had no real role in life, was becoming more spiritual and philosophical by the day, and his interests were turning towards the alternative and controversial. This wasn't the first time that he'd stepped outside the royal mold, or found his father unsympathetic. Back in 1972, he had been moved by a radio interview, which opened his eyes to what life was like for young people in deprived areas. Many of them turned to crime in the absence of families or other support. Some scribbled thoughts on the back of an envelope about how he might help, and his severance pay from the Navy formed the basis of the Prince's Trust, which is now the UK's leading youth charity and as mainstream as it is possible to be. It has given a leg up in life to well over 500,000 18 to 30-year-olds, and spawned many other initiatives, but social deprivation is a highly political topic and one, therefore, which is highly controversial for the heir to the throne to be involved in. By the early 1980s, he was straying into ever more dangerous waters. He was invited to convene a conference at Windsor for leaders in the business community to meet leaders of the black community. It was one of the most significant advances in race relations ever made, but it could have gone terribly wrong. At the same time, he was sending shock waves through the hallowed corridors of the Royal Institute of British Architecture and the British Medical Association with speeches that were sharply critical and in turn brought an avalanche of criticism on the prince's head. Edward Eton did not approve and thought the prince should curb his words and confine his activities to safer, more traditional areas. Colborne supported Charles every inch of the way, telling him to forget what previous princes of Wales had done. These were the 1980s. There was a social revolution going on outside the palace gates, a whole generation of young people who needed his leadership, and he should stop feeling sorry for himself and go out and do it. It was a fractured and unhappy household, and that July, Colborne, who had been a chief petty officer with Charles in the Navy and who was one of the few people who dared tell him what he thought, handed in his notice. He had been with the prince for 10 years and would have walked over red-hot coals for him. He had also grown very fond of Diana and felt sorry for her, but he'd had enough of being caught in the crossfire between the two of them and being the one on whom his boss took out his anger and frustration. The Prince of Wales has many strengths, but he has never happily put up with people around him who disagree with him. Colborne was an exception, and because their relationship went back to the Navy, he could get away with it. His relationship with his private secretary was another matter, and with such divergent ideas on what he should be doing with his life, it was only a matter of time before the prince and Edward Eton came to grief. The day after Colborne left, the two men had a blazing row and Eton resigned. It was an opportunity for Charles to look for a successor beyond the military and the diplomatic service, whence most royal courtiers came. He instructed a headhunter, and the man chosen to take Eton's place was a 13th baronet from the city, who was as surprised as he was flattered to have been selected. Sir John Riddell, from an old Northumberland family, had no experience of the royal family and therefore no preconceptions about how things should be done. A successful investment banker of 51, he was delightfully gentle, humorous and unassuming. He was married with a young family, of much the same age as William and Harry, therefore deeply sympathetic to the draw of the nursery.